Dev is such an amazing school, and it's just one of those lights that makes up UEA.
October 73, Dev became a separate school. A number of the staff existing in the Overseas Development Group became the core faculty of Dev, and at that time we started what was the first school of development studies in the UK. It was entirely male and entirely white, and there were no women lecturers, there were no persons of colour on the staff. At the undergraduate level, we of course had a much more international cohort of postgraduate students from the beginning, but perhaps about half UK, half international students. The school began in what was called the University Village, which was then a series of temporary prefabs that had been built. And in fact, ever since the university had been created in the 1960s, new schools always kicked off in the village, and then as the campus expanded, new buildings went up and the schools transferred from the village to the main UEA campus.
The whole venture to actually start a farm and base a lot of our activities around that farm.
The 28-acre farm, part of the University of East Anglia, is used to train students who are to work in third world countries. The object of the farm, to discover how agricultural techniques overseas can be improved.
The Dev farm was a very precious and special aspect of teaching and learning and research in the school, and it was very much associated with the whole interest in natural resources, in small-scale development. Small is beautiful, the Schumacher kind of revolution, appropriate technology, finding ways in which we could do sustainable development, but very much in a small-scale rural setting. So that was the emphasis. And as a result, we had crops and donkeys and all the things that went with that, and a huge amount of fun. And students really enjoyed that kind of hands-on learning, without a doubt.
And it wasn't just about draft animals, even though a lot of work was centred around that. It was about low-energy methods of managing land, having experiential learning connected with a number of important courses for the students in their first year and second year.
Initially, schools stayed for about 4 or 5 years waiting for a building to become available for them to move into. However, Dev, 4 or 5 years after it was created, got hit by funding cuts. Buildings didn't proceed, and so we were then left in the village, I guess, for about 10 years, which I think is time that I rather enjoyed.
And the village was very interesting because of the nature of where we were settled and where we were interacting in both teaching, in social life, and everything that was going on there, and the events we held there.
We were a sort of very identifiable, separate part almost of the university. I mean, we were very close to students at that time, I think, because there was a bar down in the campus, and people have talked about the roast.
An annual pig or lamb roast dug out of the steps of the village.
That was a time that formed much of what Dev is.
And it was interesting the way that we interacted with the students. We'd be playing volleyball with them, and that sounds petty, but you got to know the students in a quite different way.
It was a very congenial atmosphere to be with. So when we started, we had both an undergraduate intake of BA students, the first intake, and a master's program in development economics. And then it developed from that.
We came together as a bunch of very disparate staff in natural resources and social sciences, political science, economists, getting to know each other and developing multi-staff, multidisciplinary programs for the undergraduate course particularly. What we achieved there was something very, very different for all of us in learning what we were doing, because it was based on experiential learning connected with a number of important courses on the campus, on Norwich, on Norfolk, on the world in successive weeks for the first year students. And that was, for them, that was also a very interesting experience.
The actual buildings themselves were pretty decrepit. At one stage I remember we didn't even have telephones in our offices. There was one telephone at the end of the corridor, so if somebody got rung up from distant parts of the world, you'd have to sprint down the corridor to answer it. So it was all a bit primitive, shall we say, and of course it was before the days of internet or social media or any of those things, so the communications with people who were overseas, as there were a lot at that time, was quite problematic. So eventually things picked up a bit and new buildings went up and
We transferred to the main campus,
into the arts building.
and that gave it a different flavour.
Dev was a place with a huge reputation. It was radical, it was, innovative, it had many of the big beasts of development studies.
The school had already developed a very clear sense of its own identity, I think. We were able to maintain that despite the move, although we became more integrated into the rest of the university. Not long after moving over to the main campus, there were further financial cutbacks by the government to education, higher education spending, and the university was looking to make savings, and it decided that one way that it could do that would be to cut the undergraduate program in development studies, but keep the more lucrative part of the program, which was the postgraduate master's courses, particularly because they attracted mainly international students, whereas the undergraduate programs at that time was mainly home students, so the fees were much higher for the postgraduate students. And clearly that was not something that staff were terribly happy about at the time, and there was a big campaign. Questions were raised in the House of Commons, there were articles written in the Times, and we mobilised all our contacts, both nationally and internationally, to create as much of a fuss as possible about it. And eventually we were able to save the undergraduate program, although the number of students that we were able to take fell for some years after that. But the school survived and recovered over time, and by the 1990s was able to thrive and expand and become a leading centre again for studying international development.
In a sense, Dev sees itself as being on the edges in an honourable place of resistance at the margins, and that's still how we see ourselves.
So there has been that increased diversity within the faculty of the school. At the same time, there have been changes in the body of students. I think now, of course, there's a large number of women and several non-white members of staff, and much greater diversity in terms of ethnic origins. Over time, we began to get more international students at undergraduate level, and some more UK students of colour as well. Now we've had over the years several Latin Americans, Mexican students, Venezuela, Japanese, Chinese students increased in numbers, and Brazil.
Cross-cultural, lifelong friendships that develop amongst students, and it always felt to me like it was one of the best justifications for students coming from the south to the north to learn, because they get to mix in a way across an intellectual terrain in scholarship together.
So there have been these fluctuations in the origins of our international students over time, which is partly to do with global circumstances, partly due to funding, partly to do with specific recruitment campaigns by UEA that's been reflected in the students that we're getting coming into Dev.
When the school moved from terms to semesters, so we lost a summer term. Suddenly we had semesters finishing much earlier, and there wasn't much that could be done with growing things after the second semester ended with the exam period and so on. So there was a crisis with very, very little happening on the farm, and yet it was a substantial expenditure. So we did decide it was not really defensible, because it was using up resources that could be used on a much wider range of support for faculty than just this rather narrow natural resources asset. So sadly, we closed it down.
Closure of the entire farm would save an estimated £25,000 a year. According to David Gibbon, it's ironic that the government, having just honoured Bob Geldof's work for famine relief, are now threatening third world agriculture.
But it had a grand and glorious moment. The other factor in it was that the interests in the school moved much towards environmental issues, climate change, written in a much wider way to look at. It was also about brown issues as well as green issues. It was about urbanisation. So there was a tide that ran against the school. Some of them to do with UEA policy, some to do with the sort of drift in natural resources research interests. So unfortunately that was the end.
In 2000, really done a lot of work investing in the student experience and going on outings, whether it was social events or these trips out to the Broads. The master's students loved it in particular.
We also had a lot of study skills going on at that time. We had a student placement module, which students could then go and get credits by studying or by working overseas, and then bringing that back and then reflecting on that, I think, through their dissertation or through an essay. And that was essentially mapped onto the kind of what the students did naturally, which is they came to Dev wanting to dive in the deep end and really immerse themselves in understanding natural resources and the people who worked with those natural resources. So that's what we did. We pushed them into the deep end, or allowed them to go to Ireland or Scotland or internationally, travel internationally, and work out for themselves what was going on. It's quite something for a student to go and interview a farmer in a remote part of Scotland and come back and be terribly excited about the fact that they've found something out about crofting or, tourism or something.
Certainly the first decade of this millennium was a time where it was all sorts of programs being launched for interdisciplinary research, funding programs focused on global challenges, for example, and we were really very successful in tapping into those.
We were top of the National Student Survey results at that time for international development. I think, there was almost like a unanimous Dev is a great place to study.
2007, 2008, we started to think about both ODG, thinking about that name, and then Dev, and the logo Dev ODG. So we decided that Dev would stay the same acronym, but we would then change to the School of International Development. The reason for that is around that time, reading articles in the academic literature which was saying that university degrees that had the word studies in them were perhaps a little bit sort of arcane and a little bit academic, which is fine, which is what we do, of course, but we felt that we were more grounded and more experiential, and we spent a lot of time internationally working in communities and with communities that were struggling with all kinds of problems, I guess. So we were not studying development, we were in there, so it felt a little bit colonial as well. So international development worked very well for us and also mapped on closely to the Department for International Development, DFID. In November 2009, it was announced that Dev had won the prize, the Queen's Anniversary Prize, for services to working with poor communities and sustainability around natural resources. And then in 2010, we were then invited down to Buckingham Palace. Edward Acton went up to the Queen and received the prize, and I, parallel to him, went up to Prince Philip and received a a few of Prince Philip's comedy routine that he normally did, and it was a very proud moment for the school.
We were entering a totally new era in the higher education world in Britain, where the whole system became liberalised, so that there weren't quotas on undergrad numbers anymore, and any university could take as many undergrads as they wanted. And the student fee was introduced at £9,000 per term, and suddenly it was an open market for students, basically. And Dev, on the books, it was making a loss because we always have to give about 40 or 50% of our revenue to the centre. And so we weren't making enough to give enough to the centre. And so the faculty was pressurising us to make more money. And then when the liberalisation of student places came about, there was a chance to really expand our undergrad numbers, but the only way we could do that was through a new degree, and geography was the obvious answer.
There was the launch of the geography programme, and those first few years, we really had to build it into a coherent, convincing course of geography. We had to hire people, and since then it has become quite a successful aspect of our teaching in the school, quite a popular course for students.
Geography people came along and started taking up questions of cities and urbanisation.
And within a year or two, we doubled our undergrad intake from around 70 per year to 140. This was a very sort of niche group of students who were, from the very beginning, motivated to do international development.
There was growth, I think, in a number of ways in this school, not just courses, but also people. In terms of finances, it was financially at least quite a successful period. There was money, there were students, there were lots of appointments to make. When members of staff would come and say, hey, I've got this really good idea, have you got a bit of budget for this? More often than not, it was possible to say yes. But of course, it wasn't just about money. Growth in global awareness and interest around environmental issues, particularly climate change, but not just climate change. And all sorts of opportunities have presented themselves to us in terms of research funding, training courses, but also opportunities to build groups, put on new courses for undergraduates, new modules, these sorts of things. And that gave us a real kind of leadership position globally in terms of theory, research, development, profile in environmental justice.
We have seen the most extraordinary change in the staffing in the school from those early days until now. I think we actually have on paper more women staff, if you count up FTEs and so on. We've went into the Athena Swan process, we've come out with our award, we're making great progress going forward to try and tackle gender inequality amongst not only staff but students as well. And now the agenda is very much to broaden that out, to think more about race, to understanding more accurately what are the obstacles in our programs, not only in our teaching content but in student achievement and so on, that we need to be addressing across other kind of forms of identity which need to be acknowledged. So the small seed of gender has produced an enormous flowering of attention to who are we and what are we doing in Dev? What's our gender nature? What are gender relations in our school? What kind of blockages are there for different kinds of people to make progress with their careers?
Since being head of school 5 years ago, it's felt like an absolute whirlwind, which was the experience of moving from the arts building to the Zeisser building. It's a fantastic building. We've now really made it our own. This year, we welcomed our biggest ever cohort of international students. We've seen our international students grow over a number of years due to a strategy put in place by my predecessor, but it really came to fruition this year. And one of the things, of course, that cinched that for us was coming first in the REF in the previous year. And that was reflected in the amazing impact case studies we produced for the REF. It's a real recognition of our work. So work on global environmental justice, work on increasing sustainability of farming practices in sub-Saharan Africa, and work on chronic diseases in Latin America. Many students were saying to us, we've got the great environment at Dev, but we've also got confidence that we're in an intellectually top-notch place.
3 things about Dev you won't find on the internet.
Well, you will find the commitment of the teachers.
Lecturers who are vastly experienced in their various fields.
3 things.
There's a lot of opportunities in the School of Dev that you probably won't find online. They're also very supportive with funding, which really helps when you're looking for different placements. And they offer a lot of opportunities and they help you a lot with finding the perfect career that you want.
Something that's been quite exciting has been the slight change in focus to taking a more global perspective. So, when I started, it was the School of Development Studies, it changed to the School of International Development, and now a School of Global Development. And I think that represents feeling a little bit uncomfortable with the kind of development studies, studying development model, recognising that development challenges are not obviously solely located in the Global South. They certainly don't originate from the Global South, and the need for a perspective that takes that into account. Added to that, we've got colleagues working increasingly on local issues, so poverty and deprivation in Great Yarmouth, debates around Brexit, around immigration, the sustainability of Norfolk fishing communities, and we're attracting PhD students who want to work on those topics as well. So having this much more global perspective is really important in terms of understanding the world, and I think it's something that excites and engages our students, and particularly works alongside initiatives that we've done to make our understanding of development a little bit less colonial, more obviously critical.
What do you think Dev will look like in 50 years' time?
I believe that in 50 years from now, Dev would have more practical collaboration with international organizations, where there will be more technological advances, more in-depth practical field work.
In the next 50 years, I hope so the program is going to be stronger and wider, just got more people from different countries, and as well more professors, and more open to technology and other new issues that are emerging around the world.
In 50 years' time, Dev will probably be significantly bigger as a school. I think there will be a few more lecturers of colour, and I think there will be more guest lectures from people who have worked in Dev in different institutions around the world, coming in and sharing what they've learned.
I believe that Dev will be growing up with a strong reputation in academic works such as research or project, and more contribution with the global agendas, both academically or practically.
Congratulations, Dev.
Congratulations on your 50 years, Dev.
Happy 50th anniversary, Dev.
Congratulations, Dev, in your 50 years anniversary. It has been a tough path to come here, but has been really good. And in the next 50 years, I hope so we can keep contributing to the global development around the world.